And I believe we are live now. Is that correct?
Yes, we are live.
Thank you. I want to welcome each of the members of the work group. I also want to welcome the public to this fourth meeting of the work group on assessment and funding of school facilities. Before we begin, I do want to make a comment, if I may, a comment of congratulations, also a comment about the wonderful long tenure and career that our state treasurer, Nancy Kopp, who is in this work group and on this work group, has had. This week, I'm assuming that everyone listening and everybody on this work group realizes that she has announced that she will be retiring. You know, for me, Treasurer Kopp was my first subcommittee chair on appropriations and has been a mentor and a friend for many, many, many years, all those years. And also, very significantly, we refer, when we talk about school construction and school facilities, we many times refer back to the Kopp Commission, which was established after we did the Thornton formula and the work on education back in the 90s. And that Kopp Commission really set a bar for funding and started the work that we continue today. So I do want to say to you, Nancy, from all of us, and particularly from those of us who still work with you on a weekly basis, monthly basis, congratulations. We're going to miss you, but we know that your community and your family need you too. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate it. I just said on another committee to whom I was testifying, you know, I say it's an honor. It's been an honor and it's been a great challenge. Sometimes I forget to say it's been a lot of fun too. But I thank you, Rachel, I see you, and my delegate, Mr. Corman, and I think another member of that vaunted school construction committee also, as I recall. Although I don't remember, you were not county executive then, were you?
No, I was on it as a county commissioner back, representing Mako back in the days on the Cobb
Yes.
Commission. That's where it all started. I've been following in your footsteps, so to speak.
And I had a good friend on our county school board who was a chief advisor, education matters for me. So it's sort of like a hometown, you know, and it's good to be here. But thank you.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. And I wanted to start this meeting with a presentation, as you know, from DLS to do a deep dive on facilities assessment data for the work group and to have conversations about categories and weighting of systems and assets in the assessment. I still do believe that that assessment of our schools and the role of the work group is so important so that the final Maryland Condition Index is accurately reflected of the condition of the schools that our children attend. But to this date, DLS has not received a workable data set from the IAC, and therefore we are unable to have any of these conversations today. To be honest with all of you and with the public, I'm incredibly disappointed. And this has left me with more questions about the process and about the substantive nature of this data. Related to the process, beginning in July, when the work group started to meet again, DLS had asked the IAC for a complete workable data set. They received 4 data sets, all of in the last month, and each had multiple errors. The IAC has assured us and DLS that the errors are related to the extraction of the data or were logic errors and they have been corrected. But without the newest data set, DLS cannot confirm that these changes have been made, and DLS cannot do the critical work that's necessary to help guide this work group's discussion. Also related to that process, the whole concept of statewide facilities assessment was intensely predicated on LEA input. If you listen to the Knott Commission discussions or even look at the statute, it is clear how important LEA input is to this process. I have concerns from members of this work group and people outside the work group about the time spent on assessments in schools, the ability for LEAs to quick quality check their specific schools, and disagreements with the data they have seen. And these concerns worry me. I know that once the work group decides on categories and priorities, we need to hear from the LEAs before making final decisions. But it's almost the November, almost December. It is, and we haven't even begun the conversations, and I'm fearing that we're running out of time. I also have concerns substantively about the data that DLS has been able to see. Some errors are to be expected from a large data set like this, but sometimes we have pointed out by staff, or even we've seen in these presentations, that as the work group members have asked in these meetings, issues still persist in the data. For example, at the last meeting, the IC presented the assessments, the assessments do not include space attributes. Space attributes include things like temperature and relative humidity. The IAC can identify in the data they collect in their own whether a school has an HVAC system, but it cannot tell us if that HVAC system is working or if the school lacks air conditioning. And as you know, by the way, the issue of air conditioning and the issue of heat in schools in recent years have been very much a concern of governor, legislature, and comptroller. The categorization and counting of portables has not felt consistent or clear. And I think, as a matter of fact, Executive Gardner has pointed this out. And I'm not sure there are other issues that we haven't thought of that haven't been brought to the attention of the work group. To be honest, what I've seen so far gives me concern about how the work group is going to make decisions related to using this assessment and funding decisions moving forward, and whether or not the initial assessment follows the intent and spirit of the Knott Commission statute. I still do believe, as I said in the first meeting in July, that although many things have changed since the 21st Century School Facilities Act passed in 2018, the needs of school facilities has remained present. Like the Built to Learn Act, the facilities assessment is a piece in addressing these dire needs and to finally provide students with the school buildings they deserve, which is why it is important that this process and the substantive details of creating the assessment for Maryland's Condition Index are right. So I want to keep the public informed about where we are as a work group. And this is the time that I am choosing to do it. My plan is for the November 4th meeting, I will invite certain LEA representatives to present to the work group on how the assessment process worked at their end and to hear concerns that they may have about the process. Michelle will be collecting any written testimony and any other LEA members of the public or members of the public that would like to send testimony to the work group are welcome. And although Bob Gorell and the executive director of the IAC is here today, I would like to have Bob and his team present on the components of the database and respond to any questions members present today. And we will email them any concerns before November 4th meeting so we can be transparent, because DLS has not received a workable database to date for the November meeting. It may be possible to have categorizations and prioritized conversations, but I think the work group in 2019 had enough conversations about assessments and hypothetical. So the next time we talk about prioritizations and categorizations, I want it to be with a correct database produced by the data of the initial facilities assessment. I do want to give, before we move on to other business that we do have at hand today, some members the opportunity to make comments or bring up any concerns or issues that you may have about the assessment before we move on to other presentations. I want this so that the IAC can hear our concerns and also maybe possibly respond to some of those concerns before we get to the November 4th meeting, where we will have a full airing with the LEAs. So at this point, I would ask any member if you have any questions or concerns. Yes, Executive Gardner.
Thank you. I was a little slow there to raise my hand, but thank you. Thank you for your comments. I appreciate them and appreciate the concerns that you have expressed. One of the things I would like to find out is, I know that after the assessments were done in jurisdictions, that the LEAs were given some feedback and had an opportunity to provide some substantive comments or modifications or questions or whatever their feedback was on the assessment data. And I just really want to know if the LEAs have been able to get feedback from their comments, and if they know that their comments were incorporated into the assessment. I just don't really know the answer to that as to whether it's been an iterative process.
Mr. Grell, Bob, you want to take that? There you go.
Yes. All of the LEAs have direct access to the data as far as a on-screen live view of where the data sits today. It's been a process, an iterative process. As you know, there are hundreds of thousands of data points. We appreciate the work of DLS in going and checking our math, and we found some errors. In fact, it's about 0.5% of our data, which is too much. And we are scrubbing through that so that we can determine exactly what the cause were. There was a couple of patterns in there that were very bothersome. Missing of data points, one thing, but a pattern of the calculation being inaccurate, not what it should represent, was a problem. It is a problem. So we're going back through that and working through the vendor to get these corrected. And I believe we'll be able to support that November clean data. The LEAs on this scrubbing process, it is an iterative process. I wish we had more time to do this assessment. It's a very compressed schedule, but it is complete. We have a lot of confidence in this data, and we want to earn back your confidence in the data as well.
And we will, County Executive, we will hear from the LEAs at our next meeting about, and have them answer your question to see how they feel about their interactions. Delegate Corman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, ditto on all the Treasurer Kopp comments, of which I hope to have many opportunities to say more in the weeks or months ahead. But back to the matter at hand. So, Mr. Grell, I don't know if you want to address this now or if the chair would rather you wait, but I guess I'm hearing it two different ways. On the one hand, it seems like the issue is some of the data may sort of be being presented with some errors that are fixable because all the right answers are there in the data. You just have to sort of QC it and sort it out. On the other hand, I've heard more anecdotally that some things weren't maybe checked as thoroughly as they should have been. For example, a school has an electric system, but when you press the lights, they don't actually turn on. Or when the school might have HVAC installed, but it's not fully heating or cooling the building, or it's doing one and not the other. So one, I'm sort of curious about that dichotomy, and you had just said it was done on a very compressed schedule, and I know this was a somewhat troubled procurement, which happens in this world. And then I guess the second part of that is I am a little curious about how much of this might be attributable to the contractor issues. And I expressed some amazement to you a few meetings ago about how quickly they managed to get through every school, given the history of school inspections in Maryland. So I guess I just want to make sure we're sort of checking on that as well to make sure everything was done as it was supposed to be done under the contract.
So the assessment and the way that we understood the intent of the legislation was to understand the overall building conditions of the schools, not a maintenance assessment. We do that separately. So I want to make clear that the purpose we understood of the assessment was for overall condition, to be able to discern the highest needs from the lesser needs of schools within Maryland for the potential of funding the highest needs using this data. And this data, this assessment, and the way the assessment has been done is exactly for that purpose. Whenever we talk about a room with a light out or two, the question is the electrical system within the building able to support the light system going on or off, or is it a bad switch that's a maintenance problem, or a light that's out that should be replaced? And that type of an error within, or defect within the maintenance is not something we tried to capture. We tried to capture the reliability of the entire electrical system of that school. On HVAC, and that's a darn good question, is the HVAC work or not? Some schools don't have HVAC. There are many components. At least they don't have a complete HVAC. There are some schools in the state, environmental zones, that don't require air conditioning, but they do require heat. We oftentimes would visit these schools like in June. So whether the heat worked or not within a classroom or within a school oftentimes required feedback and dialogue between the LEAs and the people that they had visiting those schools. And I think we got feedback. We had representatives of the LEAs at each one of the visits. And then we had the feedback afterwards. If a heating system doesn't work, then it has to be broken down. And this is what we were really looking at. What is the condition of the boiler? What is the condition of the variable ventilation units that distribute the air through the building? Is it able to operate as a whole system? What is the remaining life on the average of these components as they are weighted together? If it doesn't work because it's a maintenance problem, that's a different question. And it's one that we also did look at our maintenance assessments when we had the data to verify things that we have seen, and we've used the assessment since to verify back the assessment data. The air conditioning some schools have ventilation in windows. They have an air conditioning system that attaches to the window. And that would be an air conditioned space. And according to the school and the way that we have done the surveys, independent of this assessment, but also during the assessment, if that unit worked, it's a working unit, it's a working air conditioner in that classroom. A question that came later is of the whole school. So we have since added back through the scrubbing process, that if a school can't provide at least 80% of its classrooms to be air conditioned, then it's a go, no go. And that's where we are using the category 1 to move those systems in that school, even though they're not completely gone. If they can't provide 80% of the classrooms with AC, it leaps the deficiencies that we find into the higher category of life, safety, and health, as we talked about a couple of meetings ago. So I would like to dig into this specifically on what we're seeing, and maybe we'll hear from the LEAs on exactly what we looked at that wasn't important. But I think that the assessment, as far as the relatively comparable and reliable information one building system against another and one school against another has been done properly. And we have to finish the delivery of that data through the information and calculations, and we have to do it properly.
I want to follow up just a little bit on that. I'm sensitive, and I think all of us in the legislature are about the air conditioning because there has been a tremendous amount of discussion about this. But, in my mind, we have these 9 categories, but in my mind, and we've had this conversation before, Mr. Grohl, if there is something wrong in a building that sends children home, that causes children to lose educational hours or days, I think that's category 1A with a star. I mean,
Yes,
it's
agreed.
like we have got to pay attention to those. And I think many of those, like mold in some counties, we've had issues with mold in some counties. We have had issues with heat, with air conditioning. There are counties that are starting, LEAs that are starting to talk to me about lead in their water. And as a matter of fact, Senator McCray has done some work in this area through legislation with members of the Montgomery County delegation. My point being, whenever you have a situation that has elevated itself to a point where the school has to send kids home, we have to be measuring that. And I do believe that it has been in and it's been out, and if it's in again, I'm happy to know. But we did get data sets, and I don't want to be, the horse here. We got data sets that did not indicate that there was any problem with lack of air conditioning in schools, where we know there's absolutely been that. But we will dive into that later. Senator McCray, you're on mute.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Madam Chair. And Director Gurrell, I guess first, I really wanted to just still lean in on the question that you were commenting in reference to temperature control.
Yes.
And like getting a better understanding of like where would something like that fare in your assessment. As the chair has stated, it's a number of these measures that's why the reason that schools close. So like, where does that fall within the data that you collected is something that I would like to hear a little bit more about. I'm not sure if that's something that you're going to lean in on future presentations would be helpful. And also I was thinking about like a number of our schools have these vertical packages where the HVAC systems, that these will be inferior to the HVAC system. So like, how does that line up in the data that you collected for the assessments? Would be interested hearing in.
Okay.
So I guess the question is like, is this stuff that you're going to be presenting to us in the future to kind of lean in on? And my last one, and I'll let you answer all of them in a row, but like from the LEA standpoint, I know that you said that they added input. If you could elaborate on the level of input that they had the opportunity to provide. And I know that we talk about like the lifespan of the systems, but because they work around those systems a great bit, were they able to also contribute other information to help this dialogue, this conversation in reference to what other challenges that they may be facing with these systems outside of just the lifespan of it?
Understand. I'll start with the last question first then.
Yes, sir.
What we have done is looked at the remaining useful life of the major building systems within a school. If that remaining useful life is 0, then it's gone. It doesn't work. It's non-functional. That was one of the data questions that we had that DLS had noticed. There were comments made about its functionality that didn't align with the facility condition index score of 0, which means that it was brand new. 100% means that it's gone. So we had something that says that it's failed and it had a score of 0. Those two don't add up. They were notes that the assessor made. We're still trying to drill into that 0.5% that had that kind of a comment that didn't add up. So we'd have to get to the bottom of it. If a piece of equipment is rated, say, on a boiler that has a 30-year lifespan, and it may have been there for 30 years, but whenever the professionals go and observe and look at the pumps and the brackets and the valves that fit around that and the ducts coming out, and they compare it to their professional opinion of how much longer it lasts, and they say that's good for another 10 years, even though its calculated life is 30 years, because they have replaced some pumps, because they have replaced the cores of the boiler within it, because they have replaced controls on it, it is actually going to last longer than the manufacturer said it would last, just like on a vehicle whenever you replace parts to renew it. And it therefore would have an FCI score of 33% because its observed remaining life is 10 years rather than 100% gone. I'm sorry, 66% depleted. So the FCI score would be 66% because it's 1/3 depleted. So if then, whenever we score that and the LEA has that information that, as I said earlier, is available even today to go look at all of the building systems, and they disagree with that, then they let us know and we responded to them. And I think it would be best to have BV, or if there is a specific LEA that has a concern with the responses, that we look at that and then we look at the record to see what were the questions and what were the responses, and then we can provide it back. But every one of the observations were challengeable, and sometimes they were changed and sometimes they weren't changed, depending. The second question, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say that that's the purpose, I hope, of the next meeting, is to get LEAs in to answer, I think Ms. Gardner's question and the senator's question. So why don't we let that happen next week so that LEAs can speak for themselves. Actually, Senator King, do you have a question?
Do I want to answer the other two, Madam Chair?
Sure, go ahead. And then I'll call on Senator King and then we'll move on.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. The vertical package units, those are an alternative to replacing the entire HVAC in a building. It's a darn good decision. I have complimented Treasurer Kopp. Can recall I complimented him BPW that was a very good solution because it did more than the little air conditioning residential units were being added on. They work, they do heating, they do cooling, and they exchange fresh air, which is important to a classroom, where the little air conditioning units that you hang on that are residential don't do heating typically, nor definitely don't do ventilation. So they're not good, healthy air. But the vertical package units were a good economy solution. They weren't the same as replacing an HVAC, but you might not want to replace an HVAC where you have to do all the ceilings, all of the duct work and everything else, including roofs. This is a way of getting the classrooms up and going, and then having that school work for another 20 years until you're ready to renew it or replace it with a good system. It's cost effective. It's a good total cost of ownership effective solution. So yes, the assessors looked at each of those. At least they understood from the if they would look at it physically, does it look like it's working? Is there something that's wrong with it? And how they're looking at it as far as their professional observation, and they would depend on the LEA to let them know that one was working, that one wasn't working. If it was a maintenance issue that needed a repair, an example might be, and we had a number of these, a ventilation unit on a roof that was perfectly workable, but it had a broken fan belt on it, so it wasn't pulling the air out, which is very important in the school. That would be recognized that the belt was broken, but if it's a pretty new piece of equipment, it would not be a deficiency to be replaced, because again, we're looking at the equipment that can't be repaired, that needs to be replaced, the equipment that has no life left on it. So we have to separate maintenance from actual equipment longevity. What we're looking at is the remaining useful life on a piece of equipment. And we do that for all of the major building systems in each school and then give an average score for the school. That's the FCI. The last one was on the temperature range, which is in the sufficiency standards of 68 to 75. Again, we looked at the system. If you have an HVAC system that was really in bad shape and past its life, it got a score that is going to demonstrate that needed to be replaced, that system. If it scored high enough, it would be in that category, and the dollar amount would be that. We would not recommend that it go into category 1, which be life, safety, and health, until we had information from the LEA. And I know we're not to waiting yet, but we would take that need to be replaced dollar amount value that's in the FCI, and we would multiply it on the sufficiency side by category 1, which would be life, safety, and health, which would raise that value up on the relative weighting between schools. That would make that school have higher needs than another school that was working, even though it was old, it was still working. And that's how that score would be applied. But it would require, unless we happen to be in there on a hot day that the air conditioning wasn't working, or on a very cool day that the heating wasn't working, we won't know unless the LEA gives us feedback. And I understand that this type of an assessment is brand new. It's not the way that we've been looking at things in the past. But as I understand, the data won't be used for funding for years from now. This is to get the baseline, and then we will continually improve the data. And the LEAs, once they realize they can provide that kind of feedback, maybe they didn't recognize that they could make the changes or what the data actually was going to result in meaning. But it is something, and it's designed to be constantly improved, constantly corrected, so that if it isn't right this first year, when it won't be used, it can be right next year, and particularly the year after when it would be used.
Okay. Senator King, do you have a question?
I do. Every LEA has had their own priority list. I'm sure everybody has for over the years. Have the assessments that were done, have they changed many of those priorities that people already had on their list?
Senator, I'm not sure that they would. They would look at the facility condition index information, which is very comparable, and they may want to look at that because sometimes those in different years and different assessors, they mean different things. The way that this has been done, it's very comparable information, and the assessor shouldn't matter. But they probably will use that as they are determining priorities going forward. It would, of course, be the LEA's election. If the state has a view of what its view is the highest priority, either it needs to be challenged and corrected, or maybe the LEA chooses to go with their own priority as they would. But the locals have a lot of pieces of information that would not play in directly to, in my opinion, to a facility assessment, even if the state has a Maryland Condition Index ranking. Like there may be a decision to redistrict, or to change this or that, which would change priorities. And until the data is corrected within the system, it would have a different output until those corrections are made. So it has to be a two-way process in order for any type of priority to align.
Okay, thank you.
We do have, this work group does have other charges, if you will, that we need to pay attention to. So we can move on to those, and a presentation today from Michael Rubenstein from DLS. The first is related to the implementation and changes from the Kerwin Commission into school construction cost share formula. And the second is on a revolving loan fund and how that could be used by the LEAs. So without any additional questions, Michael, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I guess while we get the presentation loaded up, if I could add my voice to the echoes for the treasurer. It seems like everything I do, whether it's school construction or pensions or procurement, I've had the honor of crossing paths with her on many occasions. And I just want to thank her for her service and also for her grace and wisdom and friendliness to me over the years. So thank you.
Very good. You're gonna get sick of us, Nancy.
I know. Okay, so just for context, the last session we did talk about the process for establishing the eligible square footage for a school construction program project to receive state funding. And we mentioned during that presentation that once the square footing is established and it's multiplied by the cost per square foot, you get a dollar amount for the total project cost, and then that would be subject to a state local cost share formula. And that was as much as we said. So this presentation really goes into depth on the cost share formula and how those numbers are derived. So we go to the first slide. The basically Built to Learn Act 2.0, as it's sometimes referred to, requires this work group to consider and make recommendations on the factors used in the cost share formula. So that's why we're doing this presentation. Those factors have not been updated since 2006. There you see the COP Commission. They were the ones that established the current formula and all its components. And that first took effect, the bill was passed in 2004. Those factors took effect in fiscal 2006, and they really haven't been changed since then. Now, the reason the COP Commission did its work is because they were coming on the heels of the Thornton Commission and the changes they made to the education aid formulas. And the charge for the COP Commission was to look at those changes for the education aid and see where they could apply and make changes for the school construction cost share and how they applied. So you're in a similar situation where you're coming on the heels of the blueprint, and now you're being charged with looking at the changes the blueprint made and looking at how they made affect the cost share formula for school construction. Okay, we can move on. So the state does pay at least 50% of the eligible costs and up to 100% in some cases. And you'll see that in a little bit. The county governments, including Baltimore City, pay the local shares of eligible costs and 100% of anything that is not eligible. So we mentioned in regard to space, obviously any square footage that is above the allowable amount is the responsibility of the local governments. The state just participates in the approved state square footage. Now, the state share does vary by local school system based on a formula that considers local wealth and other factors. The statute only requires the IAC to develop that formula. If you're looking for that formula in statute, it's not there. It's only in regulations. It's only in COMAR. And based on the changes made for from the NOC Commission, that formula is updated every 2 years. It used to be every 3 years. It's now every 2 years. And if the state share goes down for any school system by more than 4%, that is spread out over the 2 years. It used to be the full 3 years it would be spread out, but now it's recalculated every 2 years. So it's spread out over 2 years. Now, one key point here, the counties have been held harmless from reductions in the state share since fiscal 2019. Following the changes made by the NOC Commission, there was anticipation that this cost formula would be revisited. And so they didn't want any school systems to be affected. And you can see on the next slide how that played out. Go ahead. So first, we'll do this one first. The eligible and ineligible costs. They're delineated in the regulations. Prior to Built to Learn Act of 2020, the eligible costs were basically construction costs, bricks and mortar, as we call it. State participation was limited only to the approved square footage. And as I mentioned, any excess square footage was paid with local funds. State did not participate until recently in planning, design, furniture, fixtures, and equipment, also known as FF&E. Built to Learn did authorize state participation in the planning, design, and FF&E. Those regulations are not yet done, but there has been some discussion about them, and we anticipate the way it's going to work is there will be an add-on based on the total construction costs, and the add-ons will be 10% for planning and design and 5% of that construction cost for the FF&E as applicable. Again, this is only going to apply if the school system requests that. If they don't request it, they won't necessarily be awarded. So it does have to be part of their submission. Next.
But can I stop you there for a minute? But any school system can request it.
Any school system can request it for any project, but it have to be part of their submission.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so as I mentioned, they have been held harmless since 2019. There have been 3 separate occasions where that has been voted on. The first was when the Board of Public Works was still involved with the school construction and approval of projects. I required a vote both by the IAC and the Board of Public Works, and to affect the 19 and 20. After that, it was just the IAC affecting the fiscal 21 and 22. And then this past time, it was actually part of Chapter 698, the Built to Learn 2.0, where that held harmless provision was included in the statute. And that was 5 schools, which you'll see on the next slide. Beginning in 2023, you'll also see Garrett County was adjusted. That was a special provision. It didn't name Garrett County in the statute. It just established some criteria that said basically if a system has a 50% state share and met certain income thresholds, they would be adjusted to match their neighboring county. So Garrett County qualified and they were matched with Allegheny, which is their neighboring county. So you'll see there, they get the 90% with the star next to it. The 5 counties in bold are the ones that were held harmless in the latest round from the Built to Learn. Okay, actually, go back for 1 second. Yeah, you can see there are 2 school systems that are counties that have 100% coverage. That's Somerset and Wycomico. You do have a number that are 50% based on their wealth. That's Worcester, Montgomery, Kent, Anne Arundel, and I think that's it. Sorry, Talbot. I knew there were 5. And so, yeah, it does span from 50% to 100%. There was discussion at one point about capping it at 98%, but that was not enacted. So we do have the 2 counties at 100%. Okay. So here is the cost share formula that is in the regulations. There are a number of factors. The first one is the percentage state share of the foundation program. This is the main education aid foundation program. And prior to the COP Commission's recommendations, this was the state share formula. And what the COP Commission did was added a number of add-ons to that formula, which is shown below. The first is guaranteed tax-based program amount as a percentage of the foundation, which basically supports school systems that have higher levels of local funding. There's another add-on for free and reduced price meals, 1/5 the amount by which the FRPM percentage exceeds the state average. There's an add-on for enrollment growth. Again, the extent to which enrollment growth over 5 years exceeds the state average. There are 2 add-ons for Maryland counties or tier 1 Maryland counties that meet specified unemployment and income thresholds. You get 5 percentage points for each of those. So there are a couple of counties that get both of those. Most of them only get 1. And then there's another add-on for local school construction effort. Basically, if your effort for school construction is above 1% of your county wealth, you get an add-on for that too. And we'll show you each of these factors and how they play out. If the total is less than 50%, and there are a number, they get bumped up to the 50% minimum. So we can see here, we see how it plays out, at least for the last round. Now, these are the actual calculations. These do not reflect the hold harmless that was done. So this is the actual calculations that were done for all the counties. You can see the ones that get different pieces of the add-on. If there are any questions on that, I can, my expertise is mostly on the school construction. If you have specific questions about some of the blueprint formulas, I'll probably kick that over to Rachel, but this is how this part plays out. You can see for the tier 1, the 2 counties that get the full 10% are Somerset and Worcester.
Mhm.
Otherwise, there are a handful of counties that get just the 5%.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then we're going to look at each of these components separately. The foundation formula is the main piece. That's the uniform base cost to provide general education services. The state local cost share is wealth equalized. Lower wealth counties received higher state shares. If you go back actually to the previous slide for a second, you can see that.
Yeah.
Can we go back one more? No, there we go. So the lowest again is Worcester and Talbot at 15%. The highest is, I believe, Dorchester at 69.1%. The rest are more or less in between that. So that's the effect of the wealth equalization. Okay, back to the, yep. So the blueprint alters the local wealth calculation to be based on the November net taxable income only. Previously, it was the September and November. There were 2 calculations that were done. So that's one change. And another one that they made was the count of students to be funded is now the greater of the prior year full-time equivalent enrollment or the 3-year rolling average FTE enrollment. And that's for the benefit of counties that are losing enrollment. So only the 1-year count was used. Okay, next. The next component is the Guaranteed Tax Base Program. It provides additional state education aid to counties that have less than 80% of the statewide average wealth per pupil and provide local education funding above the minimum local share required by the foundation. You can see the list of recipients of the GTB aid, Baltimore City and a number of mostly smaller counties. The blueprint changed the calculation of wealth, slightly alters the amounts that eligible school systems receive. Based on the DLS projections, the names of the counties will not be changing, but their amounts that they will be getting will change very slightly. Okay, for the free and reduced price meal component, typically, the farms rates have been used as a principal measure of school and district level poverty rates. But for a number of reasons, those calculations are not the most reliable measures of poverty anymore. There's a concern with lack of participation in the program, both especially among immigrant populations and other concerns that are not reflected in the farms rates. So the blueprint expanded the farm counts to include participation in Medicaid, in the direct certification, and also the use of an alternative state form for those families who don't trust the federal government form and don't want to lose their federal benefits if they fill out the form. The blueprint also established new school level concentration of poverty grants and provide additional state aid on a sliding scale based on the farm percentage of at least 55%. The schools 80% and above receive the maximum per pupil amount. So they are already getting on the operating side, on the state aid side, additional help through their concentration of poverty. Okay, next slide. On the enrollment growth piece, again, it recognizes counties with above average enrollment growth using the September 30th FTE count over a 5-year period. The current formula does not reflect that 3-year FTE count average that was added in the blueprint. So the factor could be adjusted to compare the greater of FTE or 3-year average, if that's something you guys want to do. Okay. So here is the side-by-side. Again, the left column is generally the ones that were used for the current calculation. The right column is a projection. In each case, these are projections on the right side to the comparisons. It's what DLS is projecting the amounts to be. You'll see for the most part, for instance, the guaranteed tax base really doesn't change the names, does change the amounts a very little bit. You can see the changes in the state share of the foundation. Again, changes mostly pretty slightly across the board. The other two components, the tier 1 and the local capital effort, we can't project. We have to wait for that data to come in order to do the recalculation. So we only do the four components on this one.
And explain that local capital effort to me one more time.
Yeah, we're gonna come to that next slide.
Okay, good, thank you.
Yep, or next two more slides, I think. So again, tier 1 counties, also known as the 1 Maryland counties, they're defined in the economic development article. Here you see the different criteria they can meet. There's 2 related to unemployment and 1 related to income, household income. If they meet those thresholds, they are eligible for the 5%. So if they meet either of the unemployment ones, they get 5%. If they meet the household income threshold, they get the 5% bump. These are all based on the most recent 24-month period. Next slide. So the current counties are, again, Baltimore City and a number of the smaller rural counties. Again, they get 5% for each. The blueprint has no effect on the tier 1 eligibility, and we can update these until new data come in. Okay, here's the local capital effort, Madam Chair.
Yeah.
Awards counties with high local effort for school construction relative to wealth. Again, if their school construction, if their outstanding debt in a given year, plus their pay-go, adds up to more than 1% of their local wealth, they get the bump. They get the add-on. Now, there was some issues with counties not counting their full pay-go contributions. There were a number of counties that were using different sources of funding and that they weren't necessarily getting counted. So the IAC developed a clearer definition of PAYGO to capture all that extra money that was being spent. So it's actually to the county's benefit if they were using more money because they were more likely to get above that threshold.
And do we have a list of what,
I'm sorry?
do we have a list of what counties enjoy this bump?
If currently, if you go back several slides to the calculation, we can.
Is it on? It's on the previous slide. I can.
It's on an earlier slide. Yep.
I can look it up. That's fine. Okay.
So the new will.
Slide 7, if you want to go to it.
Yeah. Now the new wealth calculation that I mentioned, the use of the NTI for November,
Right.
Slightly affect these results. Probably not very much. But again, we can't update that until the next go around, until we get the new data about how much the local school systems are putting in and what their pay and outstanding debt is.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Here we have just a list of a few things you might want to think about. You know, there are obviously a couple of things that are just going to flow through automatically. For instance, the changes to the foundation program are going to flow through automatically. But these are a few additional things you might want to think about. The first one is, do you want to incorporate some sort of concentration of poverty adjustment to reflect the schools that are have the highest levels of poverty, either by system or by project? You can think about incorporating the greater than FTE count. Again, I mentioned that earlier. Currently, that's not in the current formula. That 2-year smoothing that we talked about. Right now, you know, if you're over 5%, if your state share goes down by more than 5%, that gets spread out over 2 years. One option would be just to cap the decrease in a 2-year cycle at 5%, so that there's nobody that goes down more than that over a cycle. And then the last thing would be, do you want to consider any kind of incentives for local jurisdictions to get more money through by encouraging them to improve their school maintenance and or lowering their total cost of ownership for the project? Those are the ones that have been tossed around for a few years now.
Can we just stick with this for a minute? One of the issues that I raised when the initial list came out showing what the adjustments would be made, and you mentioned that in this formula that the IAC comes up with is, you know, unemployment rates and the subdivision. And I just want to, I'm trying to be transparent here. I'm going to tell you that I asked the question about what was the unemployment rate that for Baltimore City, where I live and represent, and what was calculated as a part of this, you know, Baltimore City increasing the amount of money that it would pay towards school construction. I was told that the unemployment rate for Baltimore City, I believe, was 5%. Now, I live, work, and play in Baltimore City, and I scratched my head at that number. So I have subsequently found out that the unemployment rates that are used are basically the federal unemployment rate, which captures people who are have lost their job and are looking for employment.
Mm-hmm.
It does not capture what we have in many counties, which is a whole lot of people who've given up on employment. I mean, the people who are just not, you know, so, you know, I believe I know what I have been told through the years the unemployment rate is in a city, in Baltimore City. I know this is probably true in other counties. I know it's probably true in every county. But I will say that it is concerning when we look at, you know, the one Maryland counties in particular, that they may be, in fact, have an impact by the fact that the unemployment that is being a rate that is being incorporated in this formula doesn't reflect the total unemployment in that subdivision. And that's just, I'm just going to say this. I'm going to say I've asked staff to look into it. We haven't found any solution to it at this point, but that's something that I am interested in pursuing. We got hands up here. I'll take the treasurer of the state of Maryland first.
Thank you. I don't want to just pile on, but I'm curious. I know there are different employment-related instruments that different groups use. In fact, a couple just came by my desk a couple of days ago that were different than the ones we knew. But I've been removed from this for a while, and I wonder if it would be possible, Rachel or someone, to look at a updated list of indices of deep poverty, just to see what is being used. And I understand, because they're very different situations in different areas. I get it. But I just think it would be an interesting exercise.
I mean, long-term unemployment is definitely a challenge that has confronted some of the urban areas, and especially but also rural areas.
Rural, right? Yes,
Right.
And you know, there's some research on it, but it's a difficult thing to measure.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to measure. And the other thing is just using the federal unemployment rate. Obviously, it's an issue across the country. You know, everybody's got the same issue with how the rate is calculated. If you drop out and aren't looking for work anymore, you're not going to be in the count. But I think staff is looking at other potential metrics for that. On the tier 1 component, the way it's defined is it's 150% of the state average. That is what the add-on is based on. The unemployment rate has to be 150% above the state average. So that is something that you could adjust potentially. It could be less above the state average than 150%. That still using the same metric though. In terms of deep poverty, what the blueprint created this new category of grants, concentration of poverty grants, that are looking at still using free and reduced price meal at the school level rather than just at the system level, as Michael talked about with the expanded definition. MSDE is working on a report right now. I think it's due November 1st or 15th, looking at other measures for poverty and deep poverty, as you called it, and intergenerational poverty. Could potentially be alternate metrics that could be used for a variety of things. And so I think this is one of the things that Superintendent Chaudhary is well known for in his work in Texas. And so hoping that he can bring that expertise to us here in Maryland. So we certainly, once they finish that report, we can certainly take a look at what they're suggesting and see if there's a way, or whether you all want to incorporate that.
It would be interesting to see, and the measures that you use for dealing with a particular school may not necessarily be the same as the capacity, what's essentially a school district, really county, to contribute to school construction. I mean, it may or may not be the same sort of indicator.
No, that's exactly right. They're all kind of proxies or trying to get at different angles.
Yeah, exactly.
The county's capacity, exactly.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
thank you, Senator. I almost called you Senator. Delegate Corman. I didn't mean to insult you.
There's no higher office than delegate from District 16 as the state.
No, there is not.
Michael or Rachel, page 5 of the presentation has the state shares, and they're all great. I mean, even the sort of quote unquote worst share for Anne Arundel, Kent, Montgomery, and Talbot is 50%. But as you know, and as Michael sort of hinted with the expansion of what counts as an eligible cost, it's not as though a school being built in Anne Arundel County is 50% paid for with state tax or bond dollars. So do you have a sort of readout on what the actual share of a total school looks like in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Howard, wherever, in terms of what the actual state participation is for the total cost of the project? We're talking a lot about total cost of ownership lately. What about the total cost of the initial project and how it breaks down between the state and the local effort?
Yeah, once you factor in, as you indicated, once you factor in the ineligible costs in some of those school systems, in the 50% counties, our experiences in talking with them, the actual numbers tend to hover around 25%.
Mm-hmm.
Once it's all factored in.
But Madam Chair, I don't want to go ahead.
Go ahead.
So, but I think let's just be clear. So there's two issues in the past. So looking forward, almost all of the school construction costs are now an eligible cost and will be part of the cost share. Up to now, they haven't been. Planning, furniture and equipment, those kinds of things, which are, 10 to 15% of the cost, haven't been eligible to be shared. And from, now forward, they will be. The other piece of ineligible costs, there's really two. One is like site improvements, things that are needed to prepare the site for construction. And that's something we can talk with IAC more about, because I don't have a good sense of what share of cost that is. And then the rest of it, in terms of the additional cost, is to go back to Michael's presentation from the last meeting, where counties are building more than the maximum allowable size based on the gross area baseline.
Right.
So we can certainly look at data, and there is data to look at, recent buildings. We can certainly, do that, look at the recent buildings and costs and sizes and maximum allowances, and do a little analysis of how much counties are spending to build bigger schools. Essentially, we can certainly do that.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, there's categories of costs, and we've expanded that. We've expanded what categories of costs are eligible for the match. And then there's sort of within those categories, what is sort of what can be matched within those categories, right? So how many square foot of classroom space is the state willing to match up to? So I agree with you that more categories have been covered, but I still think you're going to have a problem of within the categories is the enough space or whatever it is going to be matched by the state. So maybe you're going to go up from 25%, but for the 50% schools, and I don't only want to focus on them, I think this is a problem for every school system, it's not going to get close to the match, the headline number on slide 5. That number is pretty misleading. Probably even for the 96% schools, to be honest with you. But I disagree on that.
And so, just so the cost share formula is not, your questions are not about the cost share formula. Your questions are about, or your issue is with the maximum space that the state will participate in, which is really the gross area baselines.
Well, geez, Rachel, if you want to pull the curtain back, yes, I'm using the cost share formula to make a point about the percentage of cost.
No, that's fine. I'm just saying, if you all want to look more closely at gross area baseline and potentially make recommendations about increasing them, then we can certainly do that. But that would be a different analysis than looking at it relative to cost share. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, Delegate, I know that you have a very good relationship with the staff, and we'll get this worked out, what the data you want. I'm surprised, by the way, I'm going to call on Mr. Willis next, but I'm shocked that County Executive Gardner hasn't jumped in on this. But, Mr. Willis, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sort of piggybacking on Mr. Corman's question. So I can only speak for Cecil County, but it's about a 60-40 split up here as far as total project cost when we look at all the other soft costs, we'll call them, like even considering land purchase in that. But our projects for the last 25 years have been about a 60-40 split, 60 being state and 40 being local. And I'd be interested if LEAs are coming to the next meeting to bring some concerns, that maybe they bring that data with them, what they're looking at in terms of total cost of a project, even though if you discount the fact that they're getting cost share formulas as part of their bricks and sticks or bricks and mortar, that they bring some sort of data about, our projects are running 50-50 or 40-60, state to local. And that might give you some indication of those counties that are building more square footage on local dollars, or are spending 10% of design fees, or those types of things that other smaller counties probably can't do based on those not being eligible costs over the years. We're excited about having those kinds of things be part of the project, as long as it doesn't take away from the total cost of what the state contributes to the project. I mean, we don't want to see that any of those reductions, obviously, but if you're adding 10% to that or 5% to that for FF&E or other considerations, that's obviously a benefit to the LEAs. But I would just be interested to see what those project costs are split in the other counties too, to see what kind of data we have there.
I mean, like Rachel said, that data is available from IBC or other sources. So, there was a study done that not commission looked at that compared the state participation across all states. And Rachel, correct me, I think that Maryland came out about 28% across the board over about a 10-year period. I think
in total.
Yeah.
A new report came out just very recently, an update of that. I haven't looked at it to see what.
Yeah.
I think I recall we're higher than that now.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
County Executive, I knew you'd be in this.
I will just concur with Delegate Corman and with Perry that there are times where we build space that we feel is essential. And I've made this example before. For instance, we've added pull-out space for English language learners in a school where we had a high population of students who needed that support. And we had to pay for that 100% on our own because it was not qualified space. And so I do think that, to be consistent with some of the objectives of Blueprint and some of these services, that there could be a discussion about qualifying some additional space, because you don't want to take that out of your classrooms or someplace else. I mean, you just need that space. So I appreciate that. So are we going to make recommendations today on those additional possible changes? Are we going to come back and do that?
We're gonna come
no
back.
decisions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Come back. Okay, Michael, you have more for us, right?
One more presentation, much shorter.
Well, we've enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you. So the local share revolving loan fund, this was established by the Knott Commission legislation in 2018. And if we can go back, yeah, we go. So yeah, so it was established by the 21st Century School Facilities Act 2018. The purpose is to provide either no or low interest loans to local governments to forward fund the local share of their school construction projects if they are unable to provide that local money up front. So I'll talk about forward funding in a minute, but no funding has been appropriated to this fund. There were some proposals and some budgets along the way, but they didn't really make sense, so they weren't funded. And the Built to Learn 2.0 from last year added this to the work group to consider and make recommendations on the purpose and the implementation of the fund, since it hasn't been funded, but it's been sitting there for a few years. Next slide. So forward funding is the notion that once a project has been accepted and approved by the IAC as ready to move forward, but has not received funding because the IAC can't afford to fund every project that it approves in that year. So some of these projects will maintain that approval for 1, 2, 3 years going forward. And in some instances, the counties will elect to basically put up their own money to forward fund those projects and get the job done. instead of waiting for the IAC to provide them with the funds. And then once the IAC has money, they can get reimbursed for those costs, but basically they're fronting the money on a local basis to pay for these projects. Now, some jurisdictions obviously don't have that capacity for a number of reasons. The main one is if they don't have the bonding capacity or to forward fund these projects and put up the local money up front. In some cases, counties will not approve a project for funding until the state money has been committed. And so therefore the school system doesn't have the authority to move forward the project until the state money comes out. So the purpose of the fund was to have a pool available to these local school systems that can't forward fund, that they could borrow either at no interest or very low interest to front that money, get the job done, and then pay it back, and they reimburse for the state eventually. Move on. So there are a few issues to consider. One is how much should be appropriated to the fund initially. There have been any number of numbers thrown around, anywhere from $2 to $20 million. Should it just be a one-time, or should there be annual contributions to the fund? Typically, revolving loan funds should be self-supporting, but there may be a need for at least a few years to put some money in, depending on how much the initial appropriation is and how quickly that money is repaid. And we have to anticipate what the demand for the program might be. So again, the repayment schedule will be an issue. If you require it to be repaid faster, say 2 years, then obviously the fund can become self-supporting much faster. If you want to give school systems more time to repay those loans, it may take longer for that fund to become self-supporting. And the last thing would be what eligibility criteria, who would be eligible to ask for money from the fund. Obviously, there are a number of counties already forward fund. And may or may not be eligible depending on how that moves forward. It could be a lot more than 20 million, frankly.
Okay. That could,
That's all I have, Madam Chair. I'm happy to answer questions.
sure. County Executive Gardner.
Thank you. I appreciate the questions and the brevity of this presentation, because there's a lot of unknowns. But I do think having this revolving loan fund for our smaller, more rural counties who don't have the debt capacity is something that levels the playing field. They may build a new school once every 10 years or a major renovation once every 10 years, and they really don't have the capacity to advance projects. And we've seen a couple of the rural counties delay a project because they have been not able to forward fund like some of the larger counties. So I would like to be able to do some homework on this with the rural counties through the Rural Coalition through MACO, and to get some input from those counties, because I don't really think they're broadly represented here. But I would like to get some data potentially to help with that. You know, I could find out outside the big 8 counties how often there are new schools or major renovation projects in those rural counties. And that would help to give us some idea of how to anticipate what demand there would be. And then I would think the repayment schedule would be similar to the payback of forward funding from the state to the locals. I mean, we have experienced different lengths of time there. Sometimes we forward fund something and it gets paid back in 2 or 3 years. Sometimes it's longer. And there is a endpoint to that. If you don't get paid back until some period of time after the school is open to students, and I don't know how long that is, I can't remember, then you can lose that reimbursement. So there always is some risk with that. But I would like to take a stab at trying to gather some data and work with some of the smaller counties on this topic, if that would be helpful.
It would be. Did you want to say something? Rachel, you looked like you wanted to respond.
I was just going to answer Commissioner Gardner's question about, or county executive, sorry, about it's 18 months. So you have to be in order for the state to use bond proceeds, you have to be reimbursed within 18 months of the project's completion. Otherwise, you're not actually, well, the state can only reimburse you with PAYGO funds. And so it's not that you can't be reimbursed. It's just that in the recent past, there has not been very much PAYGO. And so, you're basically on a long waiting list for that.
Thanks for that clarification. I knew there was something, but I didn't exactly know what it was.
But feel free to, contact staff about anything that you need, and talk to the rural counties. We would enjoy that input. Any other comments? I think overall, I might say that just in discussions with folks in the last couple of years about this notion, I do think one, could make a recommendation. I do think it would have not only for the rural counties, but some Maryland counties that don't have, it would be very helpful. But then you get into how much do you appropriate, and how much do you allow each LEA? What percentage do you allow? Each LEA, is there a cap on what one LEA can borrow, so on and so forth, and and then what's the repayment schedule, which dictates a lot of the amounts that that LEAs can borrow. But I do think, by the way, this is a very worthwhile endeavor, and I think it would help a lot of counties. I think a lot of the school districts don't quite understand it, but I'll bet you their county governments would, And I do also think when we talk about this, it's important, I believe, to make sure that it's clear that the county would do the borrowing, not the school system. School systems can't levy taxes. They don't have the ability to do this kind of work. So I think it should be, in fact, the county that is responsible in that case. But anyway, very good discussion. These are two areas that we want to have recommendations going into session. So we will make decisions on this at the next or the following meeting. Treasurer Kopp, you have a question?
Yeah, could I just, I had one question, which was, as I recall, this was discussed at the Knott Commission.
Correct.
Several times. So whatever material was developed there, if it's at all relevant now, I might want to look at it. But the other thing is to look at either state funds or new infrastructure funds, or some, I don't know if there are any Department of Education, federal funds. This sounds to me a little bit like the resiliency issue we had during the session, Senator Katie Hester Fry setting up a fund to respond to resiliency problems, flood problems, et cetera.
Right, and we were
the channel and then match things and leverage.
That's right.
Yeah.
In that case, it's, my understanding is that, there is a almost 3-to-1 match that you can get.
Yeah. I don't know that there is anything with education, but it's certainly worth looking at.
That's worth looking at. Thank you. Okay. If we have no further questions, I'm going to call this work group meeting to an end, and I thank you very much. We'll be letting you know which LEAs will be presenting to us at the next work group meeting, and allowing plenty of time for the IAC to respond to questions that we have. So I appreciate everybody's attendance. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day.